the promise that was never meant to last. It began with words that should have inspired hope, a promise made in the quiet confidence of a new administration. But over time, those words began to fade, and the promise was forgotten, consigned to the annals of political rhetoric. The story of that promise is one of ambition, idealism, and the eventual unraveling of what seemed like an unshakable commitment. To understand why this promise mattered, we need to look at the way promises shape the trajectory of leadership. At the start of every administration, there is an energy, a sense of possibility that drives the early decisions. But beneath that enthusiasm lies an inevitable truth. Not every promise can be kept, and some, though well-intentioned, are doomed to collapse under the weight of unforeseen consequences. The promise in question was one that had captured the hearts of many. It was simple, direct: to overhaul the nation's healthcare system in a way that would make healthcare affordable and accessible to every citizen. The rhetoric was clear, and the president spoke of it with conviction, making it a cornerstone of their early agenda. It was a promise that felt as if it could change the country, one that would define their legacy. In the early days of the administration, it seemed possible. Public support was strong. Legislative bodies were working together. But as time passed, the complexities of the issue began to surface. Healthcare, like many other systems, was a beast too large to control with a single stroke of policy. The administration's approach, although well-meaning, lacked the depth needed to navigate the challenges ahead. The first cracks appeared when the proposed policy met resistance in Congress. Some of the opposition came from unlikely places. Allies who had supported the president's campaign, but now found themselves unwilling to compromise on key elements. They cited costs, potential economic consequences, and concerns about the long-term viability of the system. What had seemed like a straightforward solution now appeared riddled with holes. At the same time, those who had once cheered the plan's promises began to grow impatient. Grassroots organizations, local leaders, and activists who had campaigned for change felt betrayed by the slow pace of reform. The energy that had propelled the administration into power now began to shift towards skepticism. What had once been the president's flagship promise now looked like an elusive goal, slipping further away with each passing day. Behind the scenes, advisors debated strategies. Some argued for sticking to the original vision, knowing that the promise had the power to inspire future generations. Others advocated for scaling back, suggesting that incremental changes might be the only realistic path forward. The pressure mounted, and with it came the realization that the promise, the one that had driven so many to hope, was no longer sustainable. And so, the story began to shift. The promise, once made with such confidence, began to fade into a narrative of compromise. What had been framed as a transformational moment for the country was now being redefined as a series of smaller, less impactful decisions. The nation had not forgotten the promise, but had learned the difficult lesson that not all promises can withstand the realities of leadership. What started as a defining pledge soon became the story of leadership that struggled with the limits of ambition. The promise that was never meant to last was now a symbol of how difficult it is to fulfill the dreams of a nation when the world outside demands compromise. But in that failure, there was a lesson. Not every promise can be kept, but every attempt to honor a promise shapes the narrative of leadership in ways that go beyond the outcome. As the administration continued to struggle with the weight of the promise it had made, the nation watched, waiting for clarity. What had started as a movement for universal health care had now become a source of disillusionment for many. The political landscape shifted, and the president, once so confident, now found themselves wrestling with the growing reality that not every aspiration could be fulfilled in the time frame they had envisioned. The fractures began to deepen within the administration. Advisors, once aligned behind a unified cause, now began to splinter into factions. Some clung to the original vision, unwilling to admit the depths of the challenge they faced. Others, more pragmatic, pushed for a shift in strategy. The debate grew heated, not just about the specifics of policy, but about the very nature of leadership itself. On the one side, the idealists argued that the promise must still be kept, that anything less would be a betrayal to millions who had placed their trust in the administration. They believed that the president's legacy would be defined by this policy, and the failure to deliver would be an irreparable crack in the foundation of their leadership. Their resolve, though noble, was met with growing resistance. On the other side, the pragmatists, the ones who understood the limitations of power, argued that the promise, while powerful, had become a burden too great to carry. They contended that the president's focus should now shift to smaller, more achievable goals. They warned that by clinging too tightly to the original vision, the administration risked exhausting its political capital and alienating potential allies. Their message was simple. Compromise might be the only way to maintain any progress at all. The internal conflict reached its peak in a closed-door meeting that would become one of the most pivotal moments of the administration. The president, who had once believed in the transformative potential of their promise, now faced the painful realization that it was slipping through their fingers. They listened carefully, weighing the arguments of both sides. But as the meeting wore on, it became clear that no easy resolution would come from this conversation. In that room, for the first time, the president acknowledged a truth that many had been avoiding. The promise was no longer just about health care. It had become a symbol of leadership, a test of whether they could navigate the realities of power without sacrificing their ideals. The very essence of the administration was now at stake, and the president had to decide what mattered more, the vision that had inspired millions or the pragmatic steps needed to maintain political stability. The moment was both painful and liberating. It was a turning point, one that marked the end of a chapter and the beginning of another. The president understood that the promise they had made, while still valuable, would need to be redefined in order to survive the realities of governance. But the most important lesson emerged in the aftermath. Leadership is not just about achieving one's initial promises. It's about adapting when circumstances change and finding new ways to move forward while staying true to the core values that inspired the journey in the first place. As the president addressed the nation, they acknowledged the gap between the promise and the reality, offering a more tempered vision. The nation, though disappointed, was not without hope. The new direction signaled a shift toward pragmatic change, one that still sought improvement, though at a pace that reflected the complexities of the system. And in that moment, the president's leadership was defined not by the promise that was never meant to last, but by the strength to acknowledge the truth and move the nation forward. The new direction, though tempered, offered a glimpse of something different, a leadership that could adapt without losing sight of the core values it had promised to uphold. It was a shift that many had been waiting for, but had never fully expected. The president's words, while not the fulfillment of the original promise, still carried weight. They signaled that the administration was willing to confront its challenges openly, to recalibrate, and to keep moving forward despite the setbacks. The transition from an idealistic promise to a more practical approach did not come without criticism. Political opponents seized the opportunity to highlight the administration's failure to deliver on its most ambitious campaign pledge. Media outlets echoed the sentiment, framing the shift as a loss of direction. Yet, the president remained resolute, recognizing that leadership wasn't about avoiding criticism. It was about navigating through the inevitable storms with honesty and integrity. As the administration implemented their new approach, the changes were met with mixed reactions. Some hailed the pragmatic shift as a much-needed step toward progress, acknowledging that small, incremental changes were more achievable than trying to overhaul the entire system at once. Others, especially those who had supported the original promise, felt disillusioned. They had invested their trust in the bold vision and now faced the reality of its collapse. The question arose, could this new, more gradual approach achieve the same sense of transformation, or was it simply a retreat from the lofty ideals that had initially inspired so many? In the halls of the White House, the shift in policy was accompanied by a change in tone. The energy that had once been filled with the urgency of sweeping reform now settled into a more cautious rhythm. Advisors who had once pushed for immediate action now focused on laying the groundwork for long-term, sustainable change. Every policy was examined with a new lens. What was achievable, what could be built step by step, and what lessons had been learned from the administration's earlier missteps. The president's leadership, once defined by the promise that was never meant to last, now began to take shape in a new way. They demonstrated that true leadership doesn't always require grand gestures or perfect outcomes. Sometimes, it's about finding the courage to change course when the original path no longer leads to the desired destination. The ability to pivot, to redefine expectations, and a focus on what could be done rather than what was promised became a hallmark of this new phase of governance. As the months passed, the administration began to see progress in areas they had once thought unattainable. Healthcare reform, though not as sweeping as initially envisioned, began to take shape through a series of targeted policies that improved access and affordability. While it wasn't the transformation many had hoped for, it was a step towards something better. And more importantly, it was a step that could be built upon, step by step, day by day. The nation, too, began to shift its expectations. The promise of change had not been fully realized, but the approach had evolved into something grounded in reality, built on lessons learned through both failure and success. The trust that had been shaken was slowly being rebuilt, not through idealistic promises, but through actions that demonstrated commitment to progress. Even when it wasn't as dramatic as the original vision, the president, in their final address on the matter, spoke plainly. We came to this office with vision, but we have learned that the path to change is not always linear. The road may be longer, and the obstacles greater than we imagined, but change, true change, is still possible if we have the courage to adjust when the course we are on no longer serves a greater good. It wasn't the promise they had originally made, but it was a new promise, one forged in the reality of governance and shaped by the will to move forward. So, what do you think? Has the president's willingness to adjust their approach redeemed their leadership? Or is it simply a reminder of the promises that were never meant to last? As the president closed a chapter on their healthcare promise, the nation was left to reflect on what had transpired. The promise that was never meant to last had been tested, strained, and ultimately reshaped into something far less ambitious, but perhaps more achievable. In the end, it was not the grand transformation that had been envisioned, but a series of incremental steps forward. And yet, those steps held their own value. For the president, the lesson was clear. Leadership isn't about fulfilling every promise made in the heat of the moment. It's about navigating complexities of governance with honesty and the willingness to adapt. The administration had learned at great cost that the path to meaningful change is often filled with setbacks and missteps. But the true measure of leadership lies in the ability to adjust course when the original vision no longer aligns with reality. Though the nation had hoped for more, many began to appreciate the slower, more methodical approach that emerged. The steady progress, though less glamorous, became a symbol of perseverance. The ability to pivot and adapt, to prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term triumphs, became a mark of maturity in leadership. In the following months, as policies were enacted and small victories were celebrated, the president addressed the nation again, not to boast about what had been accomplished, but to acknowledge the journey. Change is a slow process, they said, but it is a process that demands our attention, our persistence, and our ability to evolve when the road ahead shifts beneath us. The promise had not been fulfilled in the way many had hoped, but the president's leadership was redefined by the courage to continue moving forward. Even when the course was not as clear as initially imagined, the national debate on healthcare continued, as it always would, but now the conversation was grounded in reality, in what could actually be achieved, rather than in what was promised. And as the days passed, the administration found its footing once again, not through dramatic reform, but through careful, deliberate steps that would pave the way for future progress. The lesson learned was that even the most ambitious goals must be tempered by the constraints of the world as it exists, not as it was imagined to be. The president had faced a difficult truth that promises made in idealism cannot always withstand complexities of reality. Yet, by embracing that truth, they had laid the foundation for something more sustainable, something that could, over time, become its own kind of legacy. So, what do you think? Has the president's evolution in leadership set a new standard for future administrations? Or does it remain a cautionary tale of broken promises?